Welcome to the module on academic reading for postgrad coursework students. Our aim is to help you read less and think more. In other words, to make your reading more active. There are 3 sections. In the first, we give a broad view of academic reading and its purposes. In the second section, we'll look at the process of academic reading, and in section 3, we'll show you some strategies for keeping records of what you read. We hope you'll find some useful tips and strategies throughout the module. We read for many reasons, but we don't necessarily read in the same way for each of these reasons. Sometimes we just need to skim through texts. In other texts, we might only read a specific section. If we're reading for fun, for example reading a novel, we're likely to drift through it, letting our minds be carried away with the story. But if we read academic texts in this way, we're not likely to engage with the material or get much out of it. Academic reading is about extracting information and making connections, but there are many specific reasons for academic reading. Here are some of the most common reasons. Note that, particularly at postgrad level, we make new discoveries that go beyond what we've read. These discoveries could be identifying gaps in the literature or making new connections or solutions. It's useful to think of reading at 3 levels. At high school, we mainly read for information. At undergrad level, we make connections, and at postgrad level, we create meaning. But it's important to remember that each of these levels incorporates the lower levels. That is, we can't create meaning without also making connections and extracting information. Also, you won't always be reading to create meaning. Sometimes you'll just need to find information. So what is reading in the academic environment? It's much more than just decoding and understanding the words. Effective academic reading is active, purposive reading that asks questions of the text. Academic reading, particularly at postgrad level, is also about making decisions about the text by judging its worth. It's useful to think about reading as discussing the text with the author. This conversation helps us to stay actively engaged with the text. Also, with academic reading, it's not so much the quantity of reading you do, but what you actually get out of each text and how you'll use this that's important. Academic reading is closely related to critical thinking. We need to think critically to deeply understand and make sense of academic texts. At the same time, being able to read critically depends on critical thinking. In other words, knowledge depends on thought. However, it's difficult to pick up an academic text and read it critically straight away. To make it easier, there's a process you can follow. This is discussed in section 2. Before you go further, think about reading and answer the question, how do you read? What was your answer? Perhaps you said we start by reading the first word and the first line, reading line by line until we reach the end, as we were taught in primary school. However, using this strategy for academic reading is likely to end in passive reading, where you remember very little of what you've read. Clearly, we need a more effective process. It's useful to see the text as a menu. Just as you choose items on a menu, you identify specific information on text and use this for specific purposes. Of course, you might find that the text isn't useful at all, just as you might find that you don't really want to eat Chinese after all. Making active choices helps you to keep actively involved in the text. Although academic reading tends to be a cyclical process, we're showing it here linearly. Our first step is to ask some initial questions about what we want to know. Then we preview the text to see if it's likely to give us answers to these questions. If the answer is yes, we take a close read of the text, marking points that are useful to us and identifying the main points and arguments. Then we summarise and reflect how and where we'll use this information. An important point to note here is that depending on your purpose, you might only complete the first 2 steps. If you only want the gist of the text, there's no need to go into it deeply. A simple skim will do the job. Note that all of these steps involve asking questions. Perhaps the 2 most important questions to ask yourself throughout each step in this process are how the content relates to what you already know and how you might use the content. The following slides develop each of these steps in the process. Our first question is why you need to read and what kind of information will help you. Also, there's no point in reading an academic text unless you know what you want from it. Are you looking for points to develop for an argumentative essay, or are you looking for information for a report? Or maybe you're hoping to find a text that will help you to get the gist of a new topic. When you're clear about what you're looking for, you need to ask yourself where you'll find this information. In a journal article, a textbook, a book of edited chapters, an online resource maybe. Don't forget that the liaison librarian for your school can help you with your research. You'll find a list of all liaison librarians on the RMIT Library website. By authoritative, we mean who was it written by? Does this person have standing in your scholarly field? This is particularly important with online texts. If you don't know who wrote it, don't use it. How is it relevant to my current purpose? For example, how might this be useful for my essay or report? Will it help me get the gist of a topic? Generally, we should choose the most recent research to cite. Different subject areas in the university have different ideas about how old is old, but in general, you should choose articles that are no older than 5 to 8 years, unless there's a good reason for using an older text. For example, some seminal work that is older but still discussed in the literature is generally okay to use. Is the text objective and free from bias? Beware of texts that are written to persuade you. By authoritative, we mean who was it written by? Does this person have standing in your scholarly field? This is particularly important with online texts. If you don't know who wrote it, don't use it. Once you've reminded yourself of your pre-reading questions, skip through the text, looking at the title and the year, the author and the affiliation. Quickly glance at the table of contents if it has one. Check out the headings and the subheadings. While you're doing this, keep your initial questions in mind. That is, what are you looking for and why? If the text looks interesting and appropriate, skim the text to get the gist of it. Read the abstract, introduction, topic sentences of each paragraph, usually the first sentence, and the conclusion. The abstract and conclusion are useful because they summarize key information. The introduction is important because it contains the thesis statement, the main argument or point of the article. Then quickly look over the references to see who's been cited. This helps you build a picture of the key scholars in that topic area. Skimming is important because it allows you to get the gist of the text without reading the entire text. If you decide that the text isn't as useful for your purposes as you thought, you haven't wasted a lot of time reading the entire document. Finally, briefly record what you found. This is just the beginning of a personal bibliographic record, so it's okay to just write a few dot points. At least record the bibliographic details. See the record-keeping section later for more details. Before we move on to close reading, we mentioned that skimming a text involves reading the topic sentences of each paragraph. Topic sentences are important because they carry the key points in each paragraph, and if we're just trying to get the gist of the text, we don't need the detail after each point. You can see here that just by reading the topic sentence of each paragraph in green, you get the broad storyline of the text. It's difficult to define globalization. GATS has a major impact on globalization of education. Universities have encouraged internationalization. Not only do we get the big picture, but we also know where to find the details if any of the main points are important to us. Of course, it's not always as easy as this, because some writers don't habitually write the topic sentence as the first sentence. However, in most texts, you'll be able to quickly find the topic sentence with a bit of practice. When you've previewed the text and know that it will be useful, the next step is to closely read the text, which leads to reading critically. Explore the 4 different perspectives by clicking on them. Understand the content, analyze the argument, evaluate the strength of the position made, and understand how you can use the text. Just a reminder that every step in the reading process involves asking questions. We've identified some key questions in each of the following, but for further questions that might help you with close reading, download the PDF. Remember, though, that the key questions to keep asking are how the information fits with what you already know and how you might use the information. Our first pass at reading is to skip and skim to get the gist of the text. When we read for understanding, we're reading for more detail. If there are words you don't understand, try to guess what they mean first, then circle them. Keep reading, and when you've finished, find their meanings and reread the sections of the text around them. The second perspective is to analyse the text by asking questions that look at specific elements in the text. This is where your reading becomes more critical. You're asking yourself how the text works to tell the story. What are the component elements? How do they fit logically together? In reality, this perspective is often merged with evaluation, which is discussed in the following. This is where we ask how strong and valid the text is. What is its value? Critical reading is central in this perspective. It's where we ask whether the intention of the author has been fulfilled in a satisfactory way. In other words, does the text do what it set out to do? Can we feel confident about the conclusions? Is there missing or misleading information? An argument is made up of a claim, which is sometimes called a proposition, a contention, or a conclusion. This claim is then backed up with premises, also called evidence or reasons. Here's an example. We can claim that smoking is bad for our health by providing evidence. That's the two premises here. Claims and premises can be true or false. So how do we judge? Next, we'll look at some ways of judging credibility. Following that, we'll talk about inference and assumptions. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a useful starting place. For instance, if you believe red to be my favourite colour, you could back it up by my reputation for not lying, or by corroboration from other sources, for instance by noticing that most of my clothes are red and I have a set of red folders on my desk. As mentioned, we look at the weight of evidence and we make assumptions to infer the truth of a claim. Here's an example of assumptions and inference and how they relate to claims and premises. Take some time to read it and decide if the premises support the claim. If you suspect some of the assumptions that need to be true aren't true, you'd point out that the claim is weak. This is a large part of the critical evaluation part of reading. For example, if you're writing a review of the literature around a topic, you'll need to read many texts and construct a debate around the topic, arguing for a particular point of view. We often do this by grouping together authors who say the same thing and setting them in opposition to others, pointing out the relative strengths and weaknesses of each text. One of the main ways of deciding on the strengths and weaknesses of text is to identify the claims, premises, and underlying assumptions. Next, try the activity. The final phase of close reading is thinking about how you'll use the text. Although hopefully you've been thinking about this in each of the steps above, this is where you decide exactly how you'll use the information in the text. Will it add a new point to your argument in an essay? Will it add more information to a report you're writing? You also begin to think about what you need to read next. And that brings us back to the first step in the process of reading academic texts, preparing initial questions. The next section suggests some strategies for keeping records of what you read. As a researcher, we end up reading large numbers of articles. If we don't make some sort of record of what we read, we've wasted our time. Even when we're just skimming the text, it's a good idea to make brief notes. But more importantly, when we spend a lot of time and effort in close, critical reading, we don't want to waste that effort. The idea is to collect useful notes, not a huge pile of articles. Of course, we also need to be able to refer to these later, so records need to be taken in an organised, systematic way. Writing and reading are closely related activities, so it's important that we write while we read. Good annotation is a form of critical reflection. You'll always understand what you're reading better if you write while you read. Annotating a text provides a quick signal to the important stuff in a text. But please remember to only write on personal copies of text, never a library copy or a friend's. By writing down your thoughts in the margins as you read, you're actively thinking and deciding on what's important and what is less so. This aids your understanding and remembering what the text is about, and it also helps you find information again more quickly. Here's a common system for annotation. By underlining, numbering, and using a small set of symbols, along with your questions, comments, and 1 to 5 word summaries, you can create a well-marked up text that will help you with your understanding and writing later. It's useful also to create your own shorthand versions of words and concepts in your own area. For example, if your subject area is accounting, you could substitute FC for full disclosure. Also, our brain remembers colour well, so work out a system for using a variety of colours. A word of warning though, most people use highlighters for key points. The danger in doing this though is that it stands out so much that when you come back to the text you'll only see the highlighted material. Also, we sometimes read the same text for different purposes, and your highlights may only refer to your first purpose for reading and will make reading for a different purpose difficult. Click on the PDF button to see an example of a marked up text. Now we come to recording summaries of what you read. These are more permanent records you make after you've annotated texts. They're important because they allow you to more easily synthesize information from a variety of texts when you construct debates and argumentative essays or literature reviews, or compare information for a report. There are many ways to do this. Some people have a personal preference for one way over another, and sometimes your purpose for reading dictates the way you do it. We're going to briefly discuss 3 of the most common ways of recording your reading: writing a note outline, using matrices, and drawing mind maps. A note outline is one way to make notes that many find useful. Here is an example of what you might take note of if you are reading a research article, and another example for a book chapter or similar. Of course, the word numbers are only suggestions. Note that identifying keywords can help with digital searching in Word, Excel, EndNote, and Evernote, etc. You have the power to quickly search through notes to find related readings. Matrices are particularly useful for capturing information to give us an overview when synthesizing information. You might develop them from your note outlines and use them for specific purposes, such as identifying themes in the literature. Here's one simple example. Click on the PDF button to see more uses for matrices. Mind maps, or concept maps, are useful for making notes because you need to understand the key points before you can construct them. The idea is to write dot points of each of the key points, arguments, or ideas at the end of the first arms, then cluster secondary information or ideas around each of these. They also give you the opportunity to draw links between each of the arms. Here's a very simple mind map of a short text on the history of antibiotics. We hope you found some new and interesting ways to make the process of academic reading and note-making more efficient. If you'd like more information about studying and writing, check out our Learning Lab.